Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 312. And this time I'm going to talk about this record by Willie Colón, The Hustler, released on Fania Records. What I have here is 1968 first Venezuelan pressing of this record. It's considered a classic, as despite the fact that Willie Colón was just 17 when he made this record, it marks a clear break with the then dominant Boogaloo style of Latin music. And this record is also notable for being the first album-length statement by Héctor Lavoe, one of the great Latin singers of the 20th century. Willie Colón was born in the Bronx in April 1950. His family were all Puerto Rican immigrants, making him a Nuyorican, and he himself was raised by his grandmother and his aunt. The household was very musical, and Willie was immersed from birth in a whole range of Latin music. He began playing the clarinet at age 11, but he soon gravitates to brass and then particularly to the trombone. At school in the Bronx in his teen years, he forms his own orchestra, which catches the attention of a guy called Al Santiago, who had owned the well-known Latin label Alegre Records and had just started the new imprint Futura. He signs Colón at the age of just 15, and Willie and his conjunto make one recording for Futura, Fuego a Barrio, with the singer Tony Vasquez. This release, however, gets delayed. It doesn't come out until 68, and in the interim, the label goes under. Willie continues to gig with his band, most of whom are his schoolmates, and eventually they catch the attention of Johnny Pacheco and Jerry Masucci, who were starting up what would prove to be the most influential Latin label in U.S. history, Fania Records. To understand the importance of Fania Records to Latin music in New York, we have to step back a little bit. Cuban music is essential to understanding Latin music in the Americas, and in the post-war period, anything which happened in Cuba had huge ripples through the American North and South musical world. When the Cuban Revolution happens, a whole bunch of excellent musicians end up finding their way to New York. But of course, this being New York, there were already lots of great Latin players already there, particularly Puerto Rican ones. What you get is a real fusion, and out of this, a series of rhythm and dance crazes, the first of which in the early 1960s was Pechanga. Pechanga originates in and arrives from Cuba, but it finds its greatest exponents amongst Nuyorican musicians, including Ray Barreto, the great percussion player, and the flute player Johnny Pacheco. Pacheco was a Pechanga star who felt, however, that he was being ripped off by his label, and he ends up befriending a former New York cop, a guy called Jerry Masucci, who's now a lawyer, but is also a huge Latin music fan. They decide to start their own Latin label in 1964, which they named Fania, after a cafe in Havana. They start off literally selling records out of the trunk of their car, but eventually they would grow to become known as the Latin equivalent of Motown. Pacheco and Masucci had met during the Pechanga craze, which was largely contained within the world of Latin music, but the next craze, Boogaloo, was a major crossover success, and this was a blend of Latin music and R&B. Boogaloo was hugely popular in 65, 66, 67, often had English lyrics, and it was so popular that, like the jazz stars that were around when the Bossa Nova thing happened, a lot of Latin stars felt obliged to cut tracks in this new style just to remain popular, but they resented it. Despite the fact that Boogaloo was the dominant sound in Latin clubs in the mid-60s, this did not sit well with traditionalists, and those traditionalists included Willie Colón. What he wanted to do was to honor more traditional Latin sounds, so-called typical music or musica típica. And in this environment, in late 1966, Pacheco and Colón were planning Willie's first album for Fania. Willie's singer had been Tony Vasquez, but Pacheco was not keen on Vasquez, and he preferred a guy who he recommended to Colón, a guy called Héctor Lavoe. Lavoe was 3 years older than Colón. He'd been born in Puerto Rico in 1946 into a poor family in the city of Ponce, and he'd lost his mother when he was 3. His dad was a professional musician, and obviously a single dad, and he sends his son to the Juan Morel Campos School of Music in Puerto Rico. In his teen years, Hector sang locally, but he aspired to move to New York for the big time, and so in 1963, at the age of 16, over his father's objections, he moves to New York and he moves in with his sister. Within a year, he was getting gigs singing, and in 1964, he joins the New Yorker band, with whom he records his first single, Vicina Me Botó, in 1965. And if Lavoe's success wasn't necessarily instant, it was certainly sustained, because in the next year, 65, 66, he was constantly in demand. He gigs a ton, and he also appears on one of those great records by Alegre, the Alegre All-Stars series of Descarga or jam session records, and also on that jam session was Johnny Pacheco, who was heavily impressed and sought to sign him for Fania. Specifically, he wanted to pair him with Willie Colón. Now, as I mentioned, Colón did not want to replace his longtime singer Ray Vasquez, but Pacheco insisted, and he had already drafted in 2 session singers already on Colón's album. These were Elliot Romero and Yaya El Indio Pequero, who are both established singers in the Latin scene in New York. Those two had already recorded most of the vocal tracks in this first record for Colón, but when Pacheco heard Lavoe, he knew he wanted him to fill out the rest of the vocals on the record. Willie reluctantly went to hear Lavoe. He wasn't that impressed. He thought he was scrawny and ugly, not the kind of guy who should front a band. But Pacheco insisted, and Lavoe was offered a contract to do the recording session. Initially, Lavoe actually turns him down because he felt he should be invited to join Colón's band as well as be on the record. But eventually he relents because what he really wanted to do was be recorded. And he participates in those sessions, recording 4 tracks on what would become Colón's first record in 1967, El Malo. As a record, El Malo is clearly of its time. It's got a number of boogaloos, which I guess the label insisted on, some of which are sung in English. But the strongest tracks are actually the pure Latin numbers, and those include the tracks that Lavoe sings on. When it's released, the record sells well, despite being panned by the critics for being kind of a raw, youthful effort. And so Lavoe ends up getting booked into all kinds of Willie Colón gigs, and so eventually, by hook or by crook, he's in the band. Lavoe and Colón end up forming a very strong musical partnership, and what they wanted to do was play musica típica, not Boogaloo. They wanted to play pure Latin music, and this was aided and abetted by the fact that Lavoe could only sing in Spanish. So a year after that record, in 1968, when they're just 17 and 20 respectively, Colón and Lavoe head into the studio along with Colón's orchestra to make this record. This record is made in early 1968 at La Tierra Sound Studios in New York. The producer is Johnny Pacheco and the recording engineer is Jerry Masucci. Willie Colón plays the valve trombone and manages the arrangements. Héctor Lavoe is on lead vocals, and otherwise we have the existing members of Colón's conjunto. These include the percussion players Pablo Rosario on bongo and Hector Andrade on conga. Santi Gonzalez is on bass, Mark Diamond is on piano, and Joe Gonzalez plays the harmony parts on valve trombone. Finally, Nicky Marrero turns in a fantastic performance on timbales. The cover photo is taken at Jerry Masucci's dad's billiard hall in Yonkers, and interestingly enough, Lavoe is not actually on the cover. He is reproduced here on the back. He didn't want to be in the front cover because even a year after playing with these guys, he wasn't sure he wanted to be in the band. But of course, with Colón, he'd go on to make another 7 records in the next few years and create a very distinctive New York-based Latin sound. Side 1 starts with Colón's track, The Hustler, which I originally, when I first played this record a few times, thought was kind of an odd lead-off track because it isn't necessarily the most instantly memorable song at the outset, but it really grows on you. And then halfway through, Marrero is featured pretty much for the rest of the song on timbales. That is just fire. The next track, Kaleo, is a joint composition of Lavoe and Colón. This, I think, is my favorite track. I think it's a bolero. I'm not that good at identifying all by myself the different kinds of Latin music. It's a very slow, sultry kind of narrative number. It was a big hit throughout North and South America, and thematically, it's not too far off Jesse's Girl by Rick Springfield. The next track, Montero, is a hala hala, which is a Puerto Rican rhythm which, like so much contemporary Latin music, is itself in some ways imported from Africa, and in this case from Mozambique, with a heavy dose of cowbell added. And the last track on side 1, Se Acaba Este Mundo, is kind of a conservative lament about hippies that don't shower and miniskirts, very much of its time. The first track on side 2, Guajirón, is written by the piano player Mark Diamond. This is a tremendous dance floor track. The lyrics are just basically, this song is Cuban, get on the dance floor, and it's just fantastic. Then we have Colón's Eso se baila así, which is kind of the flagship statement track of this whole record because this is their manifesto about their independence from Boogaloo, and the lyrics basically say, you can dance Boogaloo music, but I'm not going to do it. In the broad sweep of history, that might not seem like such a radical statement, but it was kind of radical in their musical circles at the time. The last track in the record, Havana, is either a second bolero or maybe it's a son cubano. Either way, it's a lament for the beautiful people and the city and the countryside around Havana, which of course at this point is now a forbidden place for many Americans. This track is gorgeous and it's a total showcase for Lavoe. As I said earlier, for Latin music fans, this is a key record. It's as important in the evolution of Latin music in New York as, say, Rubber Soul or Revolver were in the development of psychedelic rock in the 60s. And if you're just starting to dabble in Latin music, this record is hugely accessible. There is something here for everyone. There's great energy, there's great playing, there's a lot of variety. And in fact, if I were to recommend a handful of Latin records for beginners, this record would be near the top of the list. It's easy to recommend, it's freely available, and for me, it's 4.5 out of 5 stars.